afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Accelerating Literacy Acquisition for Multilingual Learners. Today we have with us our partners at Reading Horizons, and our presenter is Laura Axtell. So I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get started. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of information. We'd like to always let people know you will get a copy of both the recording of this webinar as well as copies of the slides. There's going to be a lot of content, and we're going to try and have as much time as possible for questions, but you'll also get a follow-up email from us. So if you have more questions or would like to follow up with us, you'll have ways to do that. So we're going to talk about accelerating literacy acquisition. And to get started, I want you to think about your classroom or the students that you've been working with. And in the chat, first of all, think about it because there's so many. What really are the greatest challenges when you're working with multilingual learners? What have you found to be the most challenging? And put that in the chat. And just keep adding those kinds of things because that's really helpful for other people to see. There is a tremendous amount of expertise and experience in this group, and so we'd love to hear from you. So as we're going through, as I mentioned, there's going to be quite a bit of content. But it's really helpful if you can pick one or two things that are kind of an aha moment or something that you think is usable right away in your instruction or something that you can apply with your students that maybe you weren't doing before. And we'll try and get as many of those things at the end of the webinar as possible, because again, that's very helpful to see what do people find useful. And so to get started on this topic, we've always had English language learners, of course, but in the last couple of years, there's been a growing number of them from many different languages. And not only that, but there's lots of terms and acronyms, and that can be really confusing because they vary from program to program and state to state and things like that. So we're going to use the term, for the most part, multilingual learner during this session, but anybody coming from another language to English. And with all those languages and all those different students and diversity of students, we know that less than 3% of us have actually had any specialized training or certification in working with this population. And obviously that creates a challenge because many of us have had to kind of figure this out as we go along. So I'm going to present the first resource by Elsa Cardenas-Hagen, who's really become a pioneer and someone very well known in this area. Her book is really great, has lots of information. Like some of the resources you'll see, this has a more focus on students in K-12 classes in schools, but her foundational information applies to anyone. So really good way of getting some background knowledge about this topic and working with English language learners. So when we're talking about this population, and we're going to start with the fastest growing population in US schools, because obviously when you've got students, you've got their parents. So this applies as well. And so we know that for the last 5 or 6 years, the fastest growing population is English language learners. And what is the most common language of not only children, but adults coming to the US? Number 1 is Spanish. That's probably not a surprise. Number 2 is Arabic. Number 3 is Chinese. Number 4 is Vietnamese. Number 5 is Hmong. And number 6 is Somali. However, I bet that some of you would say that you're also seeing an increase in Haitian Creole, students speaking Haitian Creole, and other languages like Ukrainian and Russian and things like that for obvious reasons. So we know the population is growing. But we also know that we've got students coming that have indigenous languages, so they don't fit neatly into a box. And often those languages aren't as widely in print. So it's mostly an oral language, which can make it very challenging as well. So we're going to start by taking a poll. And our first question is, Do you think English is a very hard language to learn and teach? So this is yes or no. Have you found, or have you said, like I did in the past, that wow, English is a really hard language? Yes or no? And let's see what people think. And if you've been doing this for a while, you'll have lots of experience with this. And then we'll see results as they're coming in. So 84% of you think English is a very hard language to learn and teach. I'm going to try and change your mind just a little bit and show you some of the advantages. And then our second question is, do you feel as knowledgeable as you would like about teaching literacy skills to multilingual learners? We know that very few of us have had adequate training in this area. So, but a lot of you do have experience. So do you feel as knowledgeable as you'd like to? Yes or no? Let's see how people feel about that. So 77% say, no, you don't feel as knowledgeable. So again, that's the goal today, is to help us get a little more information and maybe some really best practices and useful information. So let me start by understanding English. 80% of English is actually patterned and predictable. So when people say, oh my gosh, English doesn't have any patterns and things like that, that is not necessarily true. There are lots of patterns. The problem is we often don't know what those patterns are or how to teach them. The other part of English that can be really challenging is that about 1/5 of all of our words, because English has adopted so many words from other languages, and many of our English words have evolved over time from languages like Greek and Latin and French and Old English, German. And so spellings and pronunciations don't match when words don't have to match when they come from another language. So that etymology, that word origin, really does cause a lot of confusion for students, but many of our words are absolutely pattern and predictable. And I'm going to show that to you. I'm going to prove that to you in a minute. But there are a couple of other advantages of English and teaching English that don't exist in other languages. One is that there are no tones in English. So if you've worked with students who come from Southeast Asia, for example, you know that many of those languages are tonal languages and have between 4 and 5 or even more tones. And tones are very, very hard for a non-speaker of that language to even discriminate, to hear. And you can say the exact same thing in a rising or falling, and it'll mean something totally different. English doesn't have tones, and that can be really useful because people coming from a variety of languages would have to understand those tones and be able to hear them. And that's really, really challenging, especially as an adult, to learn that level of tonal language. We don't have tones, but what we do have is syllable stress and the schwa. And so that can present a challenge as students get into more complex patterns in English. The other thing that's a benefit of English is that our nouns don't have gender. So they're not male or female. So when you, for example, in Spanish, we wouldn't necessarily, if you're coming to that language, you'd have to learn that over time. And that doesn't exist in English. And then the third thing that can be really helpful is that we have limited honorifics. So if you're familiar with languages like Korean or even French and other languages, the way in which you address someone who is younger than you or someone who's older and has more status would be different. We're more casual in that way. In those languages, it would be very disrespectful to not use the correct honorific, and people would think you were, speaking too casually to them. And so in English, that's not really as much of an issue. So there are 4 domains of language in all languages. So 4 areas that really have to become automatic to be considered proficient in a language. So that starts with speaking and listening. And if you've ever traveled abroad or you've worked with your English students who are learning English, you know that they have to be able to navigate their surroundings. And so some people call that survival English. I call it functional English because it really does, it's the function of what they need to be able to do depending on the setting. So for example, if you're in a correctional facility, then what you're going to need in terms of functional English may be different than if you're in an urban setting or a rural setting, etc. So speaking and listening have to come first. And as we're increasing those skills, then we're connecting to reading and writing, so print. The good news about this is that brains are the same all around the world and the brain mechanisms are the same. So no matter what language you come from, what we know about the brain is that what works with one brain will work with other brains. And the more we know, that's where the science really comes in, because the more we know about that, the more we can apply it. So Stanislas Dehaene is a French researcher who has done a lot of work in this area. His book is all about how the brain learns to read. But what we know is that written text, reading is really just a connection between oral speech and an attempt to create a visual system for the brain. And because of that, all written languages are a code for oral speech. So they're inventions. English is an invention using the Roman alphabet. Chinese is an invention. Arabic is an invention. And so because of that, when we have this code, this written code, that's why we call it decoding and encoding. So decoding is reading, encoding is spelling, because we have to have an understanding of that particular code. And the other good news here is that students who are learning to speak English, just like English speakers, learn to read the same way. So that pyramid from the National Reading Panel tells us the 5 components. We have to start with those speech sounds. You're going to hear this over and over again, that phonemic awareness, connected to print, which is phonics and decoding, building fluency and accuracy and automaticity. So fluency is not speed, it's accurate and automaticity. And then vocabulary, incredibly important for our English language learners, because the advantage of an English speaker is they already know the word orally generally, although many of them, I'm sure you see this, have very, very weak vocabulary. So even our English speakers who may be struggling readers often have very limited vocabulary. And then comprehension is both a goal and a set of skills. So how do we comprehend what we read? But what we know is it's the same process for all brains, regardless of where they come from in the world. And that's where Scarborough's reading rope can be really useful, because for many years in secondary and adult ed, we've used a top-down approach where we really were focused on comprehension, close reading strategies, and things like that, and where we were trying to build a lot of background knowledge and vocabulary and things like that. What we now know is that it has to start with word recognition. So again, that phonological and phonemic awareness, decoding and spelling, and sight recognition. So high frequency words, but also particularly high frequency words that are irregularly spelled, like of or was or love. And those have to become automatic. And we're going to talk about, cognitive load theory, but though you have to spend a lot of time there, but as students are gaining additional skills and becoming more comfortable, we can weave in and embed these other higher order skills like vocabulary and literacy and background knowledge. And those do become strategic. So this is very much like a rope with a variety of strands that over time build skilled, not only speakers and people who can understand English, but who can read and write in English. So most of some of the studies that have been done says that process takes between 4 and 7 years or longer, depending on the effectiveness of the instruction, the level of the student, lots of things like that. So lots of factors there. But we now know we need to do a bottom-up approach. And that's true for English speakers who are low-level readers as well. We have to start with word recognition and those decoding skills. And we know that too from lots of research that has substantiated the simple view of reading from Goff and Tunmer. And that is that in order to comprehend what we read, there are 2 primary components. One is you have to be able to decode the text. You have to know what the word is, and you have to know what the word means. And that is a product, not a sum. So that means if you can't decode, even if you do know what the word means in oral speech, 0 times 1 is still 0. The other thing for English language learners, however, is that there's so many things that are new to a second language like English, like syntax, which is word order. Every language has a syntax. And so in Spanish, for example, the difference can be that their adjectives often follow the noun. In English, they'll precede the noun. And so just that's why many times our students are so quiet, is they just don't understand how to communicate in English, and they come from a totally different, syntax. So, and building, simple things like how do you go from singular to plural in English, and just, all the morphology and word choice and all of the things that go into it. So while this simple view, there's a lot for English language learners that we have to consider as we're developing their literacy skills. So the other huge advantage is if we can start looking at this as asset-based. I would give a lot to be able to be bilingual or trilingual in any language. I just think it's such an advantage to be able to communicate in more than one language. But often we kind of see the lack of English as a deficit. And so we really want to take the approach that this is a positive, and that we highlight lots of strengths that our students bring. For example, many students who are coming to the US now from other countries were doctors or engineers or teachers, and have a very high level of education in their previous life. And they will bring a lot of that to their new life in the US. And so really thinking of this as an asset. Whereas when we look at it from a deficit-based language, which often happens in America, honestly, and I'll just point to the last one, which implies that English is best or first. One of the examples that I hear all the time is when we're talking about what side of the road people drive on. So in America, we drive on the right, and I will hear people say, oh yeah, they drive on the wrong side of the road. It's not wrong, it's different. And that just that belief or that conception that if it's not the way we do it, that somehow it's wrong is, I think, our first real focus is making sure that we understand that it is a benefit to have more than one language. TESOL obviously provides lots of great resources, and this is one. So the 6 principles for exemplary teaching of English learners. And principle number 1 is know your learners. That means we need to find out as much information as possible because we have so much diversity with our students. We have students who are coming again from very high levels of education, and we have students who have no formal education. They're not literate in their first language. They don't read or write. And so when you're trying to translate, that doesn't work for them because they can't read their language, right? And so knowing your students and more about their language. So when if you have been working with Spanish speakers for a long time, you probably know a lot about, how Spanish and English converge and what the similarities and differences are. But what if you get a student with a language you've never seen or heard? You need to do a little research. That's going to be important because as we're teaching our students, we really need an understanding of what we need to focus on based on their language. And of course, all of the other things, getting high quality language lessons, adapting our lessons as we need to, creating a community of that's safe and comfortable for students, because it's very, very challenging for many of our students when they're coming to a whole new country with a new culture, as you know. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you probably don't already know. So this is just some examples of a couple of languages, Spanish and English, for example, what consonant sounds exist in both languages and what consonant sounds are different in English. The major challenge with Spanish, for example, is that they have 5 vowels. Those vowel sounds are consistent. In English, we have more than 14. So we have long vowels and short vowels and vowel teams, and Spanish doesn't use an initial S blend, so you'll often hear students put an E at the beginning, so S something. But there's a lot of overlap in cognates. So for example, perfect and then perfecto. So a lot of times that's why I can read Spanish better than I can speak it, because I can pick out the words that are very, very similar. And they both use a Roman alphabet. So that's some differences and some advantages. Arabic, one of the bigger challenges is they don't use a Roman alphabet. They read from right to left, and their vowels are very different. When I was at the TSO conference this year, I talked to 3 different Arabic speakers about the vowels and got 3 different answers. So it can be challenging. And one thing, for example, is that they have the sound for B and but they don't have the sound for P, even though your mouth is doing essentially the same thing. Buh, buh. So just focusing and being aware of that is important. Vietnamese, similar thing, knowing what sounds are the same, what sounds are different. Many languages don't have TH, the TH sound, or the sound for V. And so knowing that ahead of time, a lot of the consonant sounds are going to be similar, and those are easier to pick up. But those new sounds are going to be more challenging, and they'll need more time and practice. So supporting multilingual learners in the classroom, that's really what we want to focus on. And before we go any further, I want to talk a little bit about cognitive load theory. Can you imagine, and maybe you've had this experience where you've gone to another country where you didn't speak the language and people didn't speak English. Everywhere around the world, I've been to 35 countries now, and I've trained teachers in China and West Africa, and I worked in an American international school in Thailand for 3 years. And I provided lots of training and workshops in other parts of the world. And it's very common in urban settings to find a lot of people who speak English. Many countries actually have English as an official language. So it's not until you get out to locations where they don't speak English that you'll, really experience this. But it is a huge load to try and address all the parts of a language and really be able to not only navigate, but just do the things you need to do, like get food and things like that. It's very, very complex for the brain. So what we want to do is we want to reduce the cognitive load. And there are 3 primary ways of doing that. So as we're planning lessons, as we're working with our students, we want to think about, how do we simplify things? How do we reduce what we're doing at one time? And how do we maximize what we're doing so that we can connect something that's new with less information that's been previously learned? So you're going to see that kind of as a theme over and over again, that we're going to really focus on simplifying, reducing, and maximizing. I think about language acquisition like building a brick wall. You have to start with a really solid foundation, and then that is really going to start with that speaking and listening and your first language, and then translanguaging. We're going to talk about translanguaging, what that is, and how to really utilize translanguaging to benefit our students, which means that we're going to use what they've got in their L1 and connect that to what they're learning in English. And then we add 1 brick at a time until we have automaticity. And that means practice, practice, practice. A lot of times our students will fool us. They sound better, but then you get them into text and you think they've got it, but you really haven't checked for proficiency or automaticity, and then they really struggle. So we really want to ensure that our students, that we're really, reducing the amount that we're giving them at one time, and that we practice, practice, practice until they feel comfortable and confident and can add another brick. And so you add a brick when students are ready, which means you're going to have students all over the place because students are ready at different times based on everything we talked about. I am going to talk about dyslexia at the end, and that's another factor. One of the ways, an easy way, if you don't have, bilingual student or teachers in the class or paraprofessionals, etc., is to pair more proficient students with students who are less proficient. In correctional settings, often they use adults in custody as tutors, and that could be really, really helpful. It's a peer who is often bilingual, and so our guest that you're going to see at the end of the webinar today has been very successful in getting volunteers from colleges and other places to come in. So to talk with students and to be able to divide your big groups or multi-level groups, we're going to talk about at the end. So finding ways to partner students and small groups is really, really helpful. And then lots of opportunities for meaningful connections. Sometimes when I see what students are saying and reading, I'm like, why are we doing that? That isn't really what they need. Do they really need to know that word? That's not a commonly used word. So really focusing on meaningful connections for speaking and listening. And that comes with relationships. So in your adult ed classes, I'm sure you see this in library settings, in correctional facilities, they start to form bonds because they're, struggling with the same kinds of things. And because they generally won't speak unless they're given opportunities to do that, working in small groups can be really helpful, or one-on-one. Academic bricks are always going to need more support. So when you get into that tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary that's academic in nature, they're going to need a lot more visuals, translanguaging, text and audio, etc. So when we look at the stages of second language acquisition, they're generally considered to be 5 stages. Stage 1 is a newcomer. So somebody who doesn't have, maybe only minimal English or no English. That's where we start with that functional English so that they can navigate. And so they are going to be quiet because they don't have the ability to speak or understand English. So a lot of times, I'm sure you've done this, probably with some students, we're using a lot of gestures. We're using a lot of images. We're maybe using an app to help translate something. And they're beginning then with simple words, very simple words and phrases that are usually the ones that are most important, like bathroom. And then into stage 2, now we're adding a little more complexity in terms of students having more understanding and ability to speak the language if they've had lots of practice with it. So using short phrases, and they can understand often more than they can say because they may not have the syntax yet. And also they may be very uncomfortable speaking because they don't want to make a mistake. And that's often true in some cultures more than others. And we're getting into those tier 1 language words, those common everyday usage words. Stage 3 is where we're developing and we're starting to maybe get into some academic language because they have at that point pretty good social language, oral language, but may still have difficulty with syntax and grammar. But introducing tier 2 words, so words that are consistent across content, like summarize or conclude or analyze or explain. Stage 4 is where we're getting maybe adding now some tier 3 words, so words that are specific to a particular content area like science or math, so words like photosynthesis or mitosis or something like that. And students are becoming obviously much more fluent in all areas of language development. And then stage 5 is generally where we're considering students to be proficient and where they're often exited out of ELD, English language development programs if they're in one, or because they've tested at a certain level with TABE or CASAS or something like that. So we're going to focus right now on the first 2 stages because those are the students who are going to need the most support. And again, we're going to start with that functional English, speaking and listening skills, and support for pronunciation. So really helping students get those phonemes, those sounds. And then identifying, as we mentioned, what sounds are the same, what sounds are different. And then we go into letter formation. If a student is coming from a language that doesn't use a Roman alphabet, that should be separate from instruction. Practicing letters and making the sound for that letter over and over again is going to be important. We don't want to overload students or increase the cognitive load by having them listening and trying to apply sounds while they're learning to make the letter as well. So, and then they'll come together. And then obviously multimodal sound symbol correspondence. So connecting sounds and letters, listening, speaking, reading, and writing them. And then we start with reading and spelling words, and then we move to reading and writing sentences, very simple sentences in the beginning. So functional English looks a lot different for a lot of people. I hope everybody I'm sure you've all developed some way. I've existed for a week or more in lots of countries where I could only say hello, good morning, thank you, and excuse me. To me, those are the 4 most common phrases that you need anywhere. If you want to add good night, that's great. But if I was in Japan and Korea, and even between those 2 languages, how many times did I have to practice saying that phonetically over and over again until I felt comfortable speaking? And even then, it's a little panicking when you're in the moment to try and produce that. So I really understand from an innate point of view what our students experience. And then phonology. We have 44 sounds in English, but we have 26 letters, and then we have lots of ways of spelling those sounds. So it really does help if there's a resource like a pronunciation tool or something where students can see a human mouth and they can hear a sound over and over and over again so they can replicate it. Again, lots and lots of practice. And also where there's an option to see a diagram of what the mouth is doing and to see rather the sound is voiced or voiceless. So for example, B is voiced, B, P is voiceless, even though your mouth is doing the same thing. And then, talking to our students, leveraging their knowledge of these sounds and skills. They're adults. And so they bring a lot to the table, and asking them, do you have the sound in this language if you're not sure? And can you give me an example of a word with that sound? And what does that word mean in your language? So really spending time doing that. One really great resource is minimal pairs, and minimal pairs are where a list of words are exactly the same with the exception of one sound or phoneme. And many languages, because they don't have like, a sound for V or sound for TH or the sound for B, or I'm sorry, the sound for P, for example, minimal pairs allows those exercises help students to start to hear and discriminate the difference between like a B and a D, for example. So bad and dad, and what the mouth is doing when it's forming that. And focusing on those, especially when those phonemes don't exist in a language, can be incredibly helpful. For example, a lot of times in Southeast Asia, they would say thank you instead of thank you. And then when they go to read or spell it, it's where's the S, it's not there because the TH is not what they're, used to. So in the beginning, when we're simplifying, there's been a lot of discussion about phonemic awareness and orthographic mapping. The research is pretty clear that we're working with adults. What we wanted to focus on is blending and segmenting. So when we hear the word bag and we go to spell it, what your brain is automatically doing is segmenting. It's breaking it down into those three sounds and the letters that go with those sounds. Bag, B-A-G. But when you're reading, you're blending. You're doing the exact opposite. Now we're blending all those sounds together, bag. And so that's what our students need. They need to know sounds and letters and sounds, back and forth. And so we really, in the beginning, as we're introducing them to print, want to focus on blending and segmenting. As I mentioned, we want to reduce the cognitive load. So one way to do that is to use something like letter cards. You can usually get those, at a dollar store or something. And it's better if they don't have pictures for English language learners generally, because those pictures wouldn't line up with their English pictures. So if you have an octopus, that's okay, but they wouldn't know that word necessarily. And that can be confusing. So if you have some that can be helpful, that's great. And we're going to talk about resources in a second. But the goal is over and over again to connect letter and sound, and using letter cards allows them just to pull the cards to hear and apply that, and then to manipulate those sounds still with cards. I actually really like my first bananagrams, not regular bananagrams, but my first ones, because they're little tiles, easy to cart around, and the vowels are all a similar color. So they are highlighted. And then letters that are what might be confused for reversals, like B's and D's, are different colors, so that can be helpful. And then they also have tiles, join titles for things like QU, and then the digraphs, SH, CH, etc. And so just like cards, students can, manipulate the tiles, and they don't have to worry about writing it at the same time they're trying to connect to spelling and decoding. I like this resource. I think it can be really valuable. Obviously, it makes a lot of sense that as we're going through implementing a language with students in English, that they're going to need to know words, certain words just in the community, for foods, for numbers, for all kinds of things. And so it's helpful to have something with images where there's words and that they can even work on somewhat independently. Very, very helpful. So I just want to stop for a second and have you think about it, because there is so much expertise. What resources have you found that have been very successful working with your English language learners? And put those in the chat, because that way we can share with each other. And there are so many resources out there now, way more than there were even 4 or 5 years ago, because of the numbers of English language learners. So what have you found that's been very, very successful for that population? And we'll just share that. So as we're moving from that phonology sound symbol correspondence, we need to get into syllables. And this is where it gets a little tricky. So what I often say is, using terms like CVC and open and closed syllables can actually increase the cognitive load. It doesn't mean anything to an English language learner. So I want to talk about how we're going to move into, starting at the basics and then moving into those higher level skills. So we start with letter groups of 4 or 5 syllables with one vowel. And we're only going to use one sound for every letter. So only short vowel sounds, which are the most challenging, but also the most common. And 4 consonants, B, F, D, and G. And what we're also going to do is use a reference. So whatever you can have to provide a reference tool, like a short keyword or something like that, we also use vowel cues. So when we're dictating, when we're doing that multimodal, we're using a cue so students can really focus on that. When they no longer need the cue, then you don't have to provide it anymore. And as we're going through that, then we're doing that repetition. So what's the name of the letter? What's the sound of the letter? What's the name and the sound? We use something called a bigram, a slide, to help begin immediate oral blending. And then we go from sound to sentence. So, having the letter B, the sound for the B, and then adding that to a vowel with a slide. The slider also tells us this is not a real word and we're going to move left to right. So that helps with students coming from a different orientation. And then we're going to build a word and we're going to identify the vowel. That's so important. You're going to see why in just a second. And then we're going to go to reading and writing and spelling simple sentences. So basics beyond. And then step by step, we're going to add new consonants. Now they've got 2 vowels though. And then again, just adding step by step. The other thing is focus on words that are common and concrete. What are words that they would actually need to know? And especially if they're in a vocational area, like maybe they're working in a hospital or they're, cleaning or something like that. Find the words that they need to know and start working with them in a notebook. If they're a parent and they're getting letters from the school, have them bring those to you so you can help them start to understand, first of all, translate, but also do a template for if there's a permission slip. So they'll understand what's being asked. And if you give them a template in English that they can use over and over again, that can often be helpful too. But we move from, sounds to words to sentences and reading and writing. So structured literacy has been found to be the most successful way for providing these kinds of services to English learners as well as English reader, students who are learning to read and write in English. That's a term adopted by the International Dyslexia Association. And the outer ring are the principles of structured literacy, which means explicit. We are going to assume nothing for our students until they've demonstrated that they have a skill proficiently. So all instruction clear and direct, very systematic. So we're going to move from simple to more complex. And we're going to ensure, and this is where a curriculum really does come in, you need a scope and sequence that does move simple to more complex, doesn't overwhelm students, and builds on previous skills, because that's how we reduce the cognitive load, but is also diagnostic. How do you know that a student has that skill to automaticity unless you see it? And then the inner ring are the elements of structured literacy. And that again starts with phonology, sound symbol correspondence, and then syllables connected to as they're reading and writing and discussing morphology, which is, the meaning connected to syntax, grammar, semantics, all those things. So a basic structured literacy lesson looks something like this. This is what we use based on a 30-minute block. So 5 minutes of review where the student is actually performing a task so that we can so they can demonstrate that they've retained the skill and can apply it before they move on. This is when we find if students are not ready to move on, we don't add another brick yet. We maintain that skill until they feel ready to move on. In instruction, we need to chunk a lot of our instruction to be only what can be provided by the teacher in about a 10-minute window, because then we're going to spend time doing dictation or guided practice with that particular section of the skill. So they get lots of repetition, and then moving into initial transfer, which is connecting now. We use a marking system during guided practice, and then we take it away when they get into initial transfer. And then there has to be time for extended transfer, getting into different kinds of text that could be decodable, etc. You'll see that in a moment, and then differentiating. So our students, some students are ready to move on. Some students are not ready to move on. You've got new students compared to students who have been there for a while. There's so many things that are going on in our classrooms. But the 30 minutes is important. This is exhausting work for the brain. So if you've ever tried to learn a language and really learn it, so that you're where you're speaking it or reading or writing it, you know that you have to really, really take it slow with lots of repetition. And after 30 minutes, you'll see your students start to fade. They'll start to make errors. They just get tired. And so 30 minutes at a time is really important. Then they can move to something else. If they need to work on math or listening activities or, oral language, social language, that's great. And they can come back to it, but the brain needs a break. And then if we're talking about other resources, it's really helpful to know what the English language proficiency standards are. And I want to focus on number 5 particularly, because there are 3 key instructional advances that form the standards. And if you look at what those foundational skills are, again, you're going to hear the same thing: phonological awareness, phonics, and word recognition and fluency. It's always the same thing because all brains are the same. But the 3 advances in instruction from the college and career readiness standards are regular practice with complex text, as students are able to, and it's academic language. So we have to give them lots and lots of practice. That's extended transfer. We're transferring skills in isolation to skills in text. Reading, writing, and speaking, that's grounded in evidence from text, both literary and informational. And then building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction, so informational text, especially for students who want to go on to get a high school diploma or GED, get into a vocational training program. That's essential. But as is mentioned, the standards are not a curriculum. So programs and states really need to choose high-level, high-quality curriculum that will align with the standards so that we are ensuring that we are providing that structured literacy approach that students that we know show the most effective and most effective and efficient way of acquiring second language. So now we're going to go into those single syllable types. And I didn't know this, but there are only 5 single syllables that create a long or short sound in English. And I'm just going to go through them really quickly. As I mentioned, we don't use the terms open and close, but we use a marking system. So as you saw earlier, we find the vowel, very, very important. Now we're going to look behind the vowel because it's what follows the vowel that determines whether it's short or long. And I didn't know that. So in this case, we see that there is one consonant after the vowel. In English, one consonant after the vowel makes the vowel short. So we consider that a guardian consonant. It guards the short sound of the vowel. That's just the way it works consistently. Then we look at this pattern. We have our vowel, and now we go up and around the back of the word. So we come to the P first and then the M. 2 consonants after the vowel also create the short sound of the vowel, and they're the only patterns in English that create the short sound. Very simple for students to learn. And because we've been focusing on the short vowel sounds, they can easily apply this. But now we're going to introduce long vowel sounds. So when we get to the 3rd pattern, we look after the vowel. There is no guarding consonant. So this would be the same as an open syllable. And so the vowel is long. This is what's really important. Those 3 simple patterns constitute over 70% of the most common syllable types they'll see in multisyllabic words. So you're going to see how this all kind of connects together. This is a separate pattern. Now we have 2 vowels, but E in this pattern at the end of a word is always silent because every syllable can only have 1 vowel or vowel sound. So the purpose of the E is, if it weren't there, that K would be a consonant at the end and the vowel would be short. So silent E's job is to make the first vowel long consistently in English. The last one is the most challenging, often because we taught it wrong or were taught wrong. With the 2 vowels go walk and the first one does the talking. That only applies about 32 or 33% of the time with vowel teams. So we do have 2 vowels again, like the last pattern. This time they're next to each other. But just like the silent E, the second vowel is the one that's silent to create the long sound of the first. The issue here is that there are only 9 vowel teams that follow this pattern consistently. And some of them have more than one sound. So for example, EA can be sounded 4 different ways. So those are the patterns in English that create the long and short sound. And so how do we help students support their translanguaging and L1 to L2? When with a word like that or a pattern like that, having that translation can be really, really helpful. And translanguaging between how a sentence would sound in their language, their L1, compared to how that sounds in English with an image can be really, really helpful. So just based in that very, very quick introduction, could you explain those patterns just based on the markings? So for example, number one consonant after the vowel is short. 2 consonants after the vowel is short. When the vowel stands alone, the vowel is long. When there's a silent E, the first vowel is long. And in adjacent vowels, for 9 vowel teams, the second vowel is silent to make the first vowel long. So once we understand how pattern of predictable English can be, we can really support about 75% of the words in English. But this is really where it becomes even more critical, which is when students move into multisyllabic words. And we can see why this is so confusing for our students, because in this pattern, the vowel is long. You add 1 letter and the vowel goes short. You add 1 more letter, it goes long again. So of course our students get confused. But then when they get here, now we have a second vowel that is a working vowel. And because we know that every syllable can only have 1 vowel or vowel sound, those 2 X's tell us this is a 2-syllable word. But what do we do with it then? So we are going to go to then 2 decoding skills. So we take those 5 single syllable patterns into 2 decoding skills. So in this case, we're going to find our vowel again. And when we look between the vowel, there's 1 consonant. In English, the pattern is generally that that consonant will move to the second syllable and will divide here. And then we just apply those single syllable patterns. So nothing after the vowel O would make it long. 1 consonant after the vowel would make it short, and the word is motel. So that's decoding skill 1. Decoding skill 2 is we look between our 2 vowels and we see there are 2 consonants, but they're not connected like a blend or a digraph. So they're going to split. And then again, we just apply those single syllable patterns. 1 consonant makes the vowel short, 1 consonant makes the vowel short, and the word is campus. And students move from 1 syllable to 2 syllable words. And then we're going to add the vowel sounds that are neither long nor short, like R-controlled vowels and diphthongs like OI and things like that, once students really have an understanding of the structure of English. And then our goal, of course, then is to connect to writing and reading more text. And so in the beginning, having decodable text is really, really helpful, where students can isolate a particular skill and get practice with those words and sentences, and then move into simple reading and writing, which is connected to skills. So getting a program that does that is important. And then finding Lexile leveled or other kinds of leveled text that is informational is very helpful, so that you're able to determine what a student's relative Lexile level is and make sure they're in text that's similar to that. That increases as their abilities and skills increase. And then always connecting them to some sort of authentic text as they're able to do that. And for some students that may be academic, and sometimes it's vocational, sometimes it's the newspaper or the Bible or something else. So when we're in subject specific like science or social studies and things like that, that's when we have to focus on that tier 2 and tier 3 language, which is much more complex once students get to those higher stages of proficiency. I want to talk about this just briefly before we end, because we know that dyslexia exists across languages. So a lot of times people ask, well, how do you know if it's a language barrier or if it's dyslexia? And the answer is, in the beginning, you probably don't. So you're going to start with language, because that's how if you're able to assess in both languages, great, that's really helpful. But in many cases, we're not able to. So one of the ways that you can tell is as you've been working with your students, you'll often see that many students are picking things up, and even students who speak the same language and have similar backgrounds and things like that. But often there will definitely be a difference for a student or more than one student, and you'll see that they're just making much, much slower progress. They're not retaining it. So it's kind of like we've went over it today and they seem to have it, and then the next day they don't have it, or it's like they've never seen it before. So really slow progress, often in their first language as well. So there's maybe students who don't read or write in their L1. And I'm working with a student like that now. And in the beginning, I didn't know what the issue was. But now I clearly see it. We have done so many repetitions, and she really still struggles holding on to it. So we've gone way slower and, way less complexity and what we're doing at a particular time, and lots of just flash, she uses flashcards and things like that. We have a notebook where she writes things. And that's why you need a progress monitor, because how do you keep track of who needs what and how much more support you should give unless you're doing that? And when they're demonstrating really lots of difficulty with those sounds and sound letter, the same way a child would. If you had a kid in kindergarten or first grade and they were really just struggling to hold on to the names and sounds of letters and things like that, we would often suspect or at least assess for dyslexia. And again, those high frequency words. So word identification, like the word is or of, just lots and lots of difficulty there. So implementing effective literacy for MLs is really focused on four separate things. One is time. They obviously need lots of time, and they need time with an English speaker or someone that can help them with pronunciation and things like that. We would hope that would be a minimum of 150 minutes per week, if possible. I know that's not always possible, but 30 minutes at a time. So as much time as you can get in blocks of 30 minutes for the reasons we mentioned. Educators who are enthusiastic, very supportive, knowledgeable and trained so that they can provide the right kind of environment, but also have the knowledge to more effectively support their students. Having a solid structured literacy curriculum is essential, where the materials are designed for older students and are age appropriate, and then having opportunities for students to really have those opportunities to connect to increasingly complex text, connecting their L1 and life experiences. So I'm going to have a guest speaker. So this is Barbara Erickson. So I'm going to let her introduce herself, because one of the biggest challenges is when you have multi-level and multilingual classes. And many of you do, and that's probably one of the most asked questions is, how do you do it when you've got all these different levels? So I'm going to let Barbara introduce herself first, and then she's going to answer that question. Oops, sorry. I need to share my sound.
My name is Barbara Erickson. I've been teaching at the Utah State Prison for 10 years, and I work with a variety of students. My students are ages probably 20 to 80 years old. And I work with the language learners, English language learners, and students who have maybe struggled with their English language reading skills. I've been teaching these students in classes. We usually meet a few times a week. It varies according to what their schedule is. It can vary time-wise. Weeks on end can change because the prison system is very different. Some of the needs that my students have when they come in, some of their greatest needs are trying to overcome the negative stigma that they've been given. And that's probably some of the hardest things that we have to overcome. Giving them the positive feedback that they need, that they can kind of believe in themselves, encouraging them to feel that they can have a positive experience. My name is Barbara Erickson. There are times when, as a class, we have a variety of levels in our classroom. Sometimes we'll have a new student or a group of new students coming in. And then in the same class, we'll have students who have been there for a while and they have been in the program and they know they've been there for maybe a couple of years. So I'll have a variety of levels that I need to teach in the same hour or the same day. One of the things that I like to do is have some of the students who are good at certain things help some of the new students. Sometimes they're good at introducing and maybe they speak the language of the new students coming in really well, and they can introduce some of the new things to the students. It really is nice for a student to be able to teach something. They learn it so much better when they are able to teach things. And it really is a good way for them to make another student feel welcome into the classroom also. Sometimes it just takes a few moments for an older student into the classroom to make another student feel welcome. So sometimes we'll let them introduce someone into the program. I'll work with them, let them spend a little bit of time with them, and then we'll break into groups. As they introduce some of that, I will take the new students and then I will separate them. I'll work with them separate and then have some of the older students go back in and work on some areas in the computer. Sometimes I will spread the time out so that I will work with a new group and I'll just gather them together in a circle and I'll work with them and have some of the older students work with themselves in a computer area. Other times I will take that group of students that are as you would say, maybe a resident student, take a group of maybe medium students that have been there for a medium amount of time, and they'll work in a circle with some of those. So I kind of split them up into maybe 3 groups and we'll work with them as different areas. Sometimes we'll have an area of a small group of new students, another group that might be working on the board, writing some things on the board, sentences, another group working on the computer. It's nice to split them up and have them working in different areas. It's a good idea to have times where you coordinate and have things switched around. Students need to be up and moving. They need to be feeling like that they can teach and help each other out. That interaction and speaking is very important. I think that they need to read and speak and write. If you use all of those senses, it's really important for them to be able to engage in those different ways.
So I thought it would be important to hear from an educator in corrections because we often don't hear from them and they're a large population. But I also want her to talk for a moment about how successful they've been at doing this.
Our ELL program has always had excellent level gains. And as I said, we moved them out of the ELL into the regular high school As they learn the language and get through the program, then they move into the high school, and there they finish their high school diploma. As they are in the ELL program, they do start working towards their high school diploma. We have things that they can work on towards getting their credits, high school credits. And it's really fun to see how people begin to learn that process of understanding something with English. Many times, people will have something that they know with English, and many times they're just afraid to say something. But if you get them in a smaller group.
Okay, so we're going to stop there. I know we're at time.
Our ELL
Sorry. So what would be really helpful is, I know that was a lot of information, and several people have asked in the chat, will you get copies of the slides and will you get the recording? And absolutely you will. There will actually be a few additional slides in the slide deck that you'll get, because we didn't have a lot of time to talk about examples of translanguaging, like how do you apply academic text in translanguaging. So you'll get a chance to see some of those in the slide deck that we didn't have a chance to go over today. So what I'd really like to do is have you think for a moment, is what's one thing that maybe you took away that would be important that you could apply or would be an actionable item, and put that in the chat. That's really helpful for us to hear from each other and to see what's valuable. We could easily, you know, spend another whole hour just really diving in. And I love that so many people have put things in the chat and resources, because that's how we all learn and get better and better support our students. So I also know that there were lots of questions, and some of them I was able to answer, but some of them I wasn't. And so you'll get an email from Reading Horizons as well with some resource or a way to, and if you want to contact us or have more discussion about those particular kinds of things, we are happy to do that. Thank you so much for joining us. There's so much going on in this particular area, and it's such an important topic, but one that we often don't know enough about. And as the poll showed, we all need to be more knowledgeable. So thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to having some additional conversations in the future.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you everyone for joining us today. You will receive a recording link as well as your attendance certificate. Please allow at least 24 hours before you receive that in your email. If you have any questions, please reach out to Laura. You can also reach out to me at info@coape.org. And thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.